Welcome to ypww Lesson 8. I do not own the rights to this music. Today's lesson text is coming out of Deuteronomy chapter 24, verses 19 through 22. The topic is remembrance and the moral life. Our lesson text, Deuteronomy chapter 24, verses 19 through 22. When thou cuttest down thine harvest in thy field, and hast forgot a sheaf in the field, thou shalt not go again to fetch it. It shall be for the stranger, for the fatherless, and for the widow, that the Lord thy God may bless thee in all the work of thine hands. When thou beatest thine olive tree, thou shalt not go over the boughs again. It shall be for the stranger, for the fatherless, and for the widow. When thou gatherest the grapes of thy vineyard, thou shalt not glean it afterward. It shall be for the stranger, for the fatherless, and for the widow. And thou shalt remember that thou wast a bondman in the land of Egypt. Therefore I command thee to do this thing. The lesson aim says, to demonstrate that recalling the action of God in one's past is an important feature of the Christian moral life. The memory verse says, and thou shalt remember that thou wast a bondman in the land of Egypt. And that's Deuteronomy chapter 24, verse 22, the King James Version. The NIV version of the same scripture. Remember that you were slaves in Egypt. That is why I command you to do this. The introduction says, Deuteronomy chapter 24, verse 19. Examines the gleanings of crops in the biblical communities. This law provides insight into the destiny of wheat, barley, corn, and other crops that remained in the fields after harvesting. Deuteronomy chapter 24, verse 19 demands that the harvester not return to the fields to collect crops that he overlooked or forgot and left in the fields. Furthermore, this verse implies that the gleanings in the fields were part of a social welfare system. What is more, memory plays an important part in this text. Moses wants the people to stay mindful of what God did for them. It therefore should come as no surprise that a discussion on remembrance will follow our study of the law on gleanings. The discussion says Deuteronomy chapter 24, verses 19 through 22 includes four major parts. 1. The regulation on forgotten sheaves, and that's verse 19. 2. The regulation on forgotten olives, and that's verse 20. Number 3. The regulation on forgotten grapes, and that's verse 21. And 4, the motivation for obeying the law. And that's verse 22. Deuteronomy chapter 24, verse 19, casts light on the incentive for leaving gleanings in the fields or the orchards. The sentence type we are discussing contains the if or when, then structure. The if or when part of the sentence is the protasis, and it tells you the condition or the circumstance. The then part is the apodosis, and it spells out the action one should take if or when the conditions or circumstances listed in the first part of the sentence are satisfied. Consistent with regulations that appear elsewhere in Deuteronomy chapters 12 through 26. Deuteronomy chapter 24, verse 19 links prosperity to individual moral action also. Thus, the language in this regulation regarding material retribution implies that an associate is present between yields of the land and not returning to collect gleanings of the fields, portions of grains, corn, and other staples. Deuteronomy chapter 24, verse 20 treats the gleanings of olives. This regulation provides insight into techniques for the removal of these items from the trees. Deuteronomy chapter 24, verse 20 contains the wording when you beat out your olive trees. This is a conditional clause. and it implies that beating branches with sticks or with some other objects was an efficient method for severing olives from their branches. Deuteronomy chapter 24, verse 20 is the sole regulation in the Old Testament that clearly governs the gleanings of olives. Moreover, Deuteronomy chapter 24, verse 20 admonishes harvesters to go over the olive trees only once. Thus, the reapers would beat the olive trees, and the olives that fell to the ground were the property of the farmers or the owners of the orchards. The olives that remained on the trees after the initial sweep, however, were ineligible for collection by farmers in the biblical communities. Deuteronomy chapter 24, verse 21 explores the gleanings of grapes. Deuteronomy chapter 24, verse 21 says, "When you harvest the grapes in your vineyard, do not go over the vines again." It is difficult to determine if this issue refers to grapes left on the vines or grapes that fell. Deuteronomy chapter 24, verse 22 reiterates the fact that the memory of the Israelites' enslavement in Egypt should instill proper notions about morality in individuals in the biblical communities. This literary feature shows that Deuteronomy often appeals to the memory of Israelites' enslavement in Egypt as the basis for moral decision making. This leads the present project to conclude that the memory of enslavement in Egypt claimed authority for moral action that few other phenomena could claim. The application says, the reference to the Israelites' deliverance from Egypt is an important part of this law on gleanings. More significantly, it is an essential feature of the theology in Deuteronomy. The people are constantly told to remember the move of God in the life of the community. How does this issue speak to us? Number one, remember the move of God can be a source of comfort. Thinking again about the actions of the Lord can bring serenity into one's life. When we look back and see where He brought us from, we can worry less. Just sitting around and thinking about God, just for the sake of thinking itself, can be very relaxing. That is to say, the memory of God saving us from a calamity last year can fill our hearts with joy. Spend more time thinking about Him instead of thinking about what you saw on the news, and just watch how much better you feel. Go ahead, reminisce. 2. Remembering the move of God can be a source of faith. Thinking again about the actions of the Lord can contribute to the amount of trust in God that one has. When we reflect on what God has done for us, we worry less about whether He can carry us through any future dilemma. Regardless of what we will face, we know that God is able to help us overcome it. Thinking about how He opened and closed doors for us causes us to know that God will make a way. Why not think about His move? In so doing, we can recognize that nothing is too hard for our God. 3. Remembering the move of God can be a source of inspiration. Thinking again about the actions of the Lord can move us to action. This appears to be the case in the present passage of Scripture. When we think about how He worked on our behalf, it provokes us to undertake exploits for Him. On the one hand, we are moved to share. On the other hand, we are moved to pray for others. Sometimes we find the strength to go the extra mile for someone. We take on strength to finish college or to hunt for a new job. Remembering just one thing He did for us is like a new battery. It gives us fresh energy. Our lesson illustration. Evergreen trees are commonplace in Georgia and North Carolina. Despite the weather, this type of tree remains green throughout the year. The heat of summer does not affect its color. The cold of winter does not affect its color. Despite the weather, the tree remains green. Scientists say that chemicals in the sap keep the needles from changing colors. Memories of the move of God in our lives should be just like the sap in the pine trees. They should keep us in trying times. Regardless of our circumstances, the thought of Him should position us to be like the evergreen tree. When we look back over our lives, memories of His deeds ground us. They help us to stay the course. When pressure builds from the circumstances of life, thoughts about Him can help us to remain faithful. We can be like an evergreen tree, regardless of the circumstances. We remain unchanged. We are trees planted by the rivers of water, immovable. Now the questions for today's lesson. Question 1. Most of us cannot look at someone and tell if they are actively remembering an event. Yet, as we remember, our spirits can be touched. What happens to our spirits as we remember? What do we feel, think, and perhaps do? Question 2. How does remembering what God has done affect our outlook on situations that we currently face? Write down your answers. That is the end of our lesson. God bless you and thank you for joining me today.